John D. Rockefeller gave away over $540 million in his lifetime. He built Standard Oil into the most dominant monopoly in American history. He controlled, at his peak, roughly 1.5% of the entire United States economy. And almost nobody talks about the real reason why. Not his work ethic, not his discipline, not the fact that he woke up early or stayed late or memorized every line item in his accounting ledgers. Those are the surface-level stories they sell you in business books, written by people who never built anything close to what Rockefeller built. The real reason is something that very few historians ever looked at carefully, because it sits in a leather-bound volume that most people in the West dismissed as irrelevant religious text. But Rockefeller didn't dismiss it. For 6 decades, quietly, consistently, he studied it, he referenced it, he structured his thinking and his commercial decisions around its principles. And that volume was the Talmud. I'm not here to sell you a spiritual message. I'm not going to ask you to convert to anything or believe in anything beyond what the evidence in front of you already demonstrates. What I'm going to do is show you exactly what Rockefeller was reading, what specific principles he extracted from that text, and how those same principles can be applied to your business, your deals, your partnerships, and your financial decisions starting this week. Not someday, not when you feel ready, this week. Most business coaches will never teach you what I'm about to teach you, because most business coaches learned what they know from other business coaches. They are recycling advice that came from motivational speakers who borrowed from self-help books, that borrowed from management consultants who had never actually built anything significant themselves. The source they are all missing is 3,000 years old. It has been battle-tested by merchants, by bankers, by traders, by industrialists across every civilization and every economic crisis you can name. And it still works today with the same precision it worked 3 millennia ago. So let me show you exactly what Rockefeller understood, and more importantly, let me show you how to use it. There is a principle in the Talmud, specifically in Tractate Bava Metzia, that deals with something called ona'ah. The word translates roughly to wrongful pricing or price oppression. But here is what most people get completely wrong about this concept when they first encounter it. They assume it is just a moral rule about not cheating people, a religious guideline about fairness. That is not what it is, at least not entirely. What it actually is, when you read it the way a Talmudic scholar reads it, is a precision framework for understanding the exact relationship between price, value, and trust in any commercial transaction. And when you understand it the way Rockefeller understood it, you realize it is one of the most sophisticated pricing and negotiation models ever constructed by any civilization at any point in human history. The rule states that if a merchant sells an item for more than 1/6 above its market value, the transaction can be voided entirely. If he sells for exactly 1/6 above market value, the buyer is entitled to a refund of the overcharge, but the sale itself stands. If the margin is less than 1/6 above market value, the transaction is completely valid and neither party can contest it on those grounds. Right now, your money is exposed. Inflation, market crashes, economic collapse. Most people lose everything when it hits. Jewish billionaire families never do. For 3,000 years, they've used one Torah system to protect and multiply wealth through every crisis. That system is now in one book. Link in the description and first pinned comment. Now, stop for a second and think about what this actually means in practical business terms. This is not a rule against profit. Let me be extremely clear about that, because I know how this can be misread. The Talmud does not say you cannot make money. The Talmud does not say profit is wrong, or that ambition is something to be ashamed of. What the Talmud says is that you must understand the exact threshold at which your pricing crosses from legitimate and sustainable profit into territory that destroys the relationship, invites legal challenge, damages your reputation in the market, and ultimately collapses the deal and every future deal that could have come from it. That is not a moral lecture. That is pricing strategy at its most sophisticated. That is one of the most precise frameworks for sustainable margin management you will ever encounter in any business school curriculum or any consulting engagement. Here is why this matters for your business, right now, today, in the market you are operating in. Most entrepreneurs price their products or services based on one of two broken models. Either they price based on cost, plus a gut feel markup that has no relationship to perceived value, or they price based on what their competitors charge and then try to undercut slightly to win on price. Both of those models leave enormous money on the table, but more importantly, both of them ignore the single most critical variable in any transaction, which is the perceived value gap in the mind of the buyer at the moment of decision. Onar tells you something that 1,000 pricing courses will never teach you. It tells you that every buyer has an internal threshold, a specific point beyond which the price feels exploitative rather than merely expensive, and the moment you cross that threshold, you do not just lose the sale, you lose the relationship, you lose the referral, you lose the reputation. And in a world where reputation travels faster than any advertisement you could ever buy, that is the most expensive mistake you can make in business. That threshold is not arbitrary, it is not random, it is measurable, and the Talmud was quantifying it when Rome was still a collection of villages built on a swamp by a river. Rockefeller understood this not as a moral guideline, but as a competitive weapon. Standard Oil's most powerful tool was not monopoly through brute force alone. It was monopoly through pricing discipline, applied with surgical precision. Rockefeller would undercut competitors just enough to acquire their market share, but never so aggressively that it triggered the kind of widespread public outrage that would invite government intervention before he was ready to handle it. Every deal you've ever lost, every salary you didn't get, every contract that fell apart, happened because you didn't have this. For 3,000 years, Jewish billionaires have negotiated with 12 Talmud tactics that nobody taught you. I put every single one in one book, the Talmud Negotiation Bible. Link in the description and first pinned comment. Get it now. He maintained relationships with suppliers by paying prices that were fair enough to keep them loyal and motivated, but not so generous that he sacrificed the margin he needed to fund his next expansion. He calibrated every single deal, every single contract, every single supplier relationship to stay within a specific zone of acceptable value exchange. That is ona'ah, applied to industrial capitalism at scale, and he did it for 6 decades while reading, every single morning before the rest of his household woke up, the text that originally defined it. Now, I want to give you something even more specific and more actionable, because the Talmud does not just give you the pricing rule in isolation, it gives you the full negotiation architecture and the information strategy that makes the pricing rule work. And this is where we need to talk about Jacob, because Jacob is the most underrated business operator in the entire biblical record. Most people know Jacob from Sunday school or from childhood religious education. The guy who wrestled with an angel, the father of 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. Fine. That is the religious story, and it is a powerful one. But here is the business story, because the business story is in many ways more impressive than the religious one, and almost nobody tells it this way. Jacob arrives in Haran with nothing. 0 capital, 0 assets, 0 connections in that market, no reputation in that city, no collateral to offer any lender. He is, by any modern definition, a broke immigrant entrepreneur, starting from absolute zero in a completely foreign market, where he knows nobody and nobody knows him. He goes to work for his uncle Laban, who is one of the shrewdest and most calculating operators described anywhere in the Torah. The agreement they strike is a 14-year labor contract in exchange for the right to marry Laban's daughters. But here is what serious business people never study when they read this story. After those 14 years are complete, Jacob does not leave. He negotiates a second deal, and the second deal is where the real lesson lives. In Genesis chapter 30, Jacob proposes what is essentially a performance-based compensation structure tied to a specific and unusual metric. He says to Laban, "Give me all the spotted and streaked animals from your flock as my share of the compensation going forward, and you keep everything else, every solid-colored animal, which is the clear majority." Laban agrees to this immediately, and he agrees because from his perspective, it looks like a terrible deal for Jacob. The spotted and streaked animals are the minority of any flock under normal breeding conditions. Laban thinks he is getting free labor with almost no compensation obligation. What Laban does not understand, because he has not been paying close enough attention, is that Jacob has spent 14 years studying the specific breeding patterns and genetic tendencies of that exact flock in those exact environmental conditions. He has essentially completed 14 years of what we would today call deep market research, proprietary data collection, and operational analysis before sitting down to propose the deal. When he finally negotiates his exit and equity terms, he structures the entire agreement around an information asymmetry that took him 14 years of patient, disciplined work to build. Within 6 years of that second agreement, Jacob owns the majority of the flock, and Laban is effectively working for him. That is not luck. That is not the story of a man who got lucky because God liked him. That is the systematic application of two principles that the Talmud later codified explicitly. The first is da'at, which means deep contextual knowledge acquired through sustained engagement with a specific domain. The second is cheshbon, which translates directly to precise accounting and mathematical calculation applied to a decision before that decision is made. The man who enters a negotiation with superior domain-specific information will consistently structure deals that appear unfavorable on the surface, but are mathematically favorable in execution over time. Every serious operator in every serious industry knows this, but very few of them know that this model has a 3,500-year-old textbook that not only describes it, but gives you the procedural steps to execute it yourself. Now let me bring this forward to the modern era, because I know some of you are thinking that ancient livestock breeding deals in the desert of the Middle East do not map directly to your SaaS business or your real estate portfolio or your consulting practice. Let me show you that they map exactly. In the Diamond District on 47th Street in Manhattan, something happens every single business day that completely confounds outside observers who witness it for the first time. Deals worth hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of dollars are closed with a handshake. No contract signed in that moment. No lawyers present. No lengthy terms and conditions document reviewed by compliance. Just two people, a stone on the table, a loop, and a single spoken phrase. The phrase is Mazel Ubracha, which means luck and blessing, and it seals the deal as completely and as bindingly as any contract you could have a team of attorneys draft for 6 weeks. And here is the critical point that makes this relevant to you. That system, that handshake system with no paper trail, has a default rate that is a tiny fraction of what you see in industries that have 10 layers of legal documentation, mandatory arbitration clauses, and penalty structures for non-performance. Why? How is it possible that the industry with the least paperwork has the most reliable commercial behavior? Because the entire diamond trade operates on a principle drawn directly from Tractate Bava Batra in the Talmud, which establishes that your word in commerce is a form of legal property transfer. To violate a verbal commercial agreement is not treated as merely unethical. It is treated structurally as a form of theft. And the community enforces this not through external courts, but through something that functions exactly like a credit score, except that the currency being measured is not money, it is trust. Specifically, it is your reputation for absolute commercial reliability across every transaction you have ever completed in that community. In a market where the product is small, easily portable, extraordinarily high in value per unit, and easily concealed from any external auditor. Trust is not a soft skill you develop at a leadership retreat. Trust is the literal infrastructure of the entire market. Without it, the market cannot function. And so the market has developed over generations a system for building, measuring, and enforcing it with remarkable precision. Here is the direct business application for you. Most entrepreneurs operating in the digital age are so focused on contracts and terms of service and intellectual property protections and legal frameworks that they never invest meaningfully in building the one asset that makes all of those documents largely unnecessary. That asset is a reputation for absolute commercial reliability. The Jewish merchants of the Diamond District do not need ironclad contracts at the moment of sale, because their word is already ironclad before they walk into the room. Their reputation precedes every transaction they will ever have. That is not a cultural quirk that you cannot replicate. It is a deliberately constructed system of consistent commercial behavior that any person in any industry can build if they understand what behaviors actually compound into that kind of reputation. And the Talmud gives you the specific framework for building it. The first step is to never make a commitment you have not already fully calculated in terms of your actual operational capacity to deliver. Not in terms of what you desire to deliver, not in terms of what sounds impressive to the client, but in terms of what your current resources, your current team, your current systems can actually produce reliably. This is what Jacob did for 14 years before he proposed his deal. He calculated before he committed. The second step is to fulfill every commitment you make to your smallest partner before you focus on impressing your largest one. The Talmud in Tractate Bava Kama discusses explicitly the principle that reputational damage compounds at a rate far greater than any single financial gain can offset over time. One broken promise to a small vendor, a small contractor, a small client will cost you more in lifetime network value than you gained by breaking it. The third step is to make your agreements specific enough that they cannot be genuinely misinterpreted by either party. The Talmud spends extraordinary detail on the precise language of commercial agreements, not because the rabbis were lawyers who liked complexity, but because vague agreements are the single greatest source of commercial disputes and the single greatest destroyer of business relationships. Precision in the language of your agreements is not a legal nicety. It is financial self-protection at the most fundamental level. Let me ask you something directly right now. How many of your current client agreements have ambiguous deliverable definitions? How many of your partnership structures have undefined decision-making protocols for situations where the two of you disagree? How many of your vendor relationships are operating on a verbal understanding that both parties would describe slightly differently if asked to write it down independently? Every one of those ambiguities is a future dispute that has not happened yet. The Talmud designed an entire legal and commercial system specifically to eliminate those ambiguities before they became conflicts. That system is available to you. Most people just never knew where to find it. There is one more principle I need to give you before we close, because it connects everything else, and it is the principle that I believe is most directly responsible for the long arc wealth accumulation that characterizes the most successful Jewish-owned businesses across multiple generations. It comes from Tractate Kiddushin, and it deals with the concept of what is called a shtar, which is a formal commercial document or partnership agreement. The Talmudic discussion of the shtar is extensive and nuanced, but at its core, it establishes one principle that modern entrepreneurs learn almost universally, only after they have already been destroyed by a bad partnership. And that principle is this: the terms of any partnership must be agreed upon and documented completely before any value has been created between the parties. The reason is not procedural. The reason is deeply psychological and mathematically sound. Once both parties have invested time, money, emotional energy, and effort into a venture together, they develop fundamentally different internal valuations of their own contributions relative to the other party's contributions. The person who contributed more labor will place a different and higher value on that labor than the person who contributed capital. The person who contributed the initial idea will overvalue the idea relative to the execution work that followed it. These differing valuations make it nearly impossible to reach a genuinely fair agreement after the fact, because there is no longer a shared baseline for what fair means. The Star principle solves this by requiring that the agreement be reached before the emotional investment begins, when both parties are still operating in what I call the logic window, the period before sweat equity and sunk cost create the cognitive distortions that make negotiation brutal. I have sat across the table from founders who lost companies generating 8 figures in annual revenue because they built the entire business on a handshake partnership with their co-founder and never formalized the equity split, the decision rights, or the exit mechanism. I have watched joint ventures collapse at the most valuable moment in their life cycle because the parties never agreed on what happens when one partner wants to sell and the other does not. The Talmud identified every one of these failure modes over 2,000 years ago and built a procedural solution into its commercial law. And the entrepreneurs I watch make these mistakes today are making mistakes that ancient rabbis specifically designed a protocol to prevent. The application is straightforward. Before you give anyone equity in anything you are building, before you enter any joint venture, before you bring on any partner in any capacity, you write the complete star, every term, every contingency, every exit scenario, every decision right structure, every definition of what each party is responsible for delivering. You write it before any work begins. You write it before any revenue arrives. You write it before emotions and investment create the distortions that make hard conversations impossible. This is not pessimism about the relationship. It is the most optimistic and the most protective thing you can do for a relationship you actually want to last and to generate wealth for both parties over a long period of time. The partnerships that survive and scale across years and decades are the ones where every hard conversation happened before the hard situation did. The partnerships that collapse, and most of them do collapse, are the ones where people assumed that good intentions at the beginning were a substitute for clear agreements. Good intentions are not a substitute for clear agreements. The Talmud knew this when it mandated the Shtar. Rockefeller knew this when he structured every partnership and supplier relationship with documented terms before operations began. And now, you know it too. Here is what I want you to take away from everything I have given you today, because I am going to say it in exactly the way a CEO would say it, not the way a pastor would say it. The reason most businesses fail is structural. They fail because they are built on pricing models that silently erode trust until the client relationship collapses. They fail because they operate on partnership agreements that contain the seeds of future conflict from the day they are signed, or worse, from the day they are not signed. They fail because their operators confuse good intentions with good systems. And they fail because the people building them never access the oldest, most tested, most comprehensive commercial framework ever assembled, which has been sitting in leather-bound volumes in libraries and homes for 3,000 years, generating compounding wealth for the people who took it seriously enough to actually study it and apply it. Rockefeller took it seriously. He took it seriously enough to study it for 60 years, while publicly presenting himself as a simple Sunday school teacher. The framework he was actually operating from was ancient, precise, multi-layered, and devastatingly effective, applied to the scale of industrial capitalism. Now, you have access to the same framework. Here is your action plan for this week, and I am giving you 3 specific things, because 3 is the number of actions that a person can actually execute before the next thing distracts them. First, audit your pricing against the Ona'ah framework this week. Look at your 3 most important client relationships or your most important product line and ask yourself honestly where you sit on the perceived value spectrum. Are you pricing in a way that makes your client feel they are receiving significantly more than they are paying, or are you pricing in a way that makes them feel they are being extracted from? Adjust accordingly. You may find you should raise prices in some areas and lower them in others, and both of those moves will increase your long-term revenue because both of them increase the commercial trust that drives retention and referral. Second, if you have any partnership or joint venture currently operating without a complete written agreement covering equity, decision rights, and exit scenarios, stop everything else and write that agreement this week. Today, if possible. The conversation is easier now than it will ever be again, and harder than it will ever be after the first major disagreement. Third, identify the one area of your current market where you have genuine information asymmetry, where you know something your competitors do not know, or where you have operational insight that took you years to develop through direct experience. That is your Jacob position. That is where your next major deal should be structured from. Do not give that information away freely. Package it, protect it, and use it as the foundation of your next negotiation. The Torah is not just a holy book. The Talmud is not just a religious commentary produced by ancient scholars with no connection to the world you operate in today. They are the oldest, most tested, most battle-hardened business manuals in human history. Civilizations have risen and collapsed around them. Markets have crashed and been rebuilt. Currencies have been inflated to worthlessness and replaced. Empires that seemed permanent have turned to dust. And through every single one of those disruptions, the commercial principles encoded in these texts have continued to generate wealth, generation after generation, for the people who understood them and applied them with the discipline and precision they deserve. Rockefeller understood that. Jacob understood it. The merchants of the Diamond District understand it every single day when they close million-dollar deals with a handshake and the word Maisel. And now you understand it too. If this kind of content is adding real, measurable value to how you think about building wealth and structuring your business, subscribe to this channel. Not because I am asking you to be polite. Subscribe because every video I release on this channel is another chapter of the oldest and most proven business manual ever written, applied directly to the deals, the partnerships, the pricing decisions, and the financial structures you are navigating right now in your business. The people who engage with this content consistently are building differently than the people who do not. They are building with a framework that has 3,000 years of empirical proof behind it. And you now have one more page of it. Use it.